This is the Bryan Hyde Show.
Well, hello there, and welcome to the show. Gotta tell you, that was a busy weekend. We helped my son David move, and he's at that fortunate stage of life where he's acquired enough material possessions, to have a comfortable life, but small enough amount of possessions that you could still carry it in, one good truckload or a couple of trailer loads. You don't have to get the big 26-foot moving van to carry it out. But even so, man, oh man, I'll tell you what, I am really feeling the pain of having been far too sedentary for far too long. And I have muscles that I have discovered that I'm like, wow, that's right. Once upon a time, I used to use those muscles. And right now, all I'm feeling is a lot of pain and a lot of discomfort from, a lot of inactivity. That's something I've been working on, but apparently not hard enough. Anyway, hope you're having a great week as we move into the heart of April. This month is already going quickly, but it's an exciting time out there. I don't know if you saw the news about the protests over the weekend. There's a couple of things about this that I think bear mentioning. One thing is, if you look at the people who attended these protests, and no doubt about it, these were very large, very well-attended protests. Thousands of people showing up to express their displeasure with Trump, with Elon Musk, with the idea that all of that plunder that maybe they're recipients of. I say that because a majority of these folks were boomers, senior citizens. That's one of the interesting things that you see when you look closely at that crowd. Lots of older white people, very few people of color, very few young people, just a lot of outrage on the part of, I think we can safely say, mostly senior citizens, many of whom were bussed in. And I just did the story last week. I wrote an article for one of the outfits that I write for about how it's very clear that many of these protests are actually they're rent-a-crowds. They pay people to show up to protest. And I think the greatest evidence of this was a little over a week ago. There were protests down in somewhere in Texas. And when the clock hit noon, guess what? The protest was over. Boom. Well, why is that? Well, because they were only paid to be there protesting until noon. So it's an interesting thing on the one hand that they're and even the Democrats are starting to come out and openly acknowledge that George Soros and others are funding this, and yes, they're bussing people in, but it appears that's it's the hey, whatever it takes by any means necessary, we're going to get out there and protest. And once in a while, you'll see some smaller protests like the one at UC Davis in California. Holy smokes. I believe it was Turning Point USA had set up a little sunshade, a little sun tent and a table, and they were hosting, they tend to have these ask me a question or try to change my mind efforts to engage people in thoughtful conversation. And instead, it brought out this crowd of Antifa miscreants who, popped open their umbrellas and held up little barriers to try to shield what they were doing. But they went in there, flipped the tables over, stole everything that they could, destroyed the tent. And the crazy thing about it is, in the video footage, you can clearly see cops standing there doing nothing. There's another expression I would like to use, but it would not be very flattering toward them. But they just sat there and let them do it, which raises some questions as to why is that accepted, or why is that if it had been somebody wearing a Proud Boys shirt, going in there and disrupting some leftist thing, of course it would be front page news all over the place. Kind of crazy stuff. So yeah, big protests, but are they really grassroots? Are they organic? That's something that's rather doubtful. And if you wonder, well, why would it primarily be older, senior citizens and so forth? Well, let's take a quick look at where do the majority of those people still get their news? And I'm sorry, I'm going to use the term boomers. I don't mean to be derogatory, but where do the boomers get their news? They still get it through mainstream outlets like ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN. In other words, they're reacting to the propaganda that they've been fed, and it's apparently working. They're out there in numbers. Now, this is none of this is to suggest that, Trump is above reproach and he should not be, in any way questioned. Actually, I kind of had my first instance here last week. An article I submitted, again, for a publication that I write for. I wrote about tariffs and particularly how there are a handful of senators, at least GOP senators, who have stood up and said, this is a tax. And if it's a tax, it really should be voted on by the lawmaking body that has the power to levy taxes. So yeah, it was casting a bit of doubt on Trump's tariffs. And look, maybe he's this master negotiator. I know 50 countries, or the heads of 50 different countries against whom these tariffs are to be levied, have reached out to him and said, hey, we're willing to sit down and negotiate. But in good faith, I was reporting on, and here, there's not everybody's on board with the tariffs, even within the GOP, and there are some good reasons. There are some things worth considering. And I got back this, it was a polite, but it was also a very curt message saying, look, this is a pro-Trump publication. Maybe better off not to be publishing anti-tariff stories. Okay, message received. But it also sends a little bit of a chill up my spine, because it's like, at some point, I'm going to have to make the choice. Am I going to be a shill, or am I going to try to write honestly? Now, I understand it's a conservative, publication, and I do write with a conservative audience in mind, but, I don't like to see the cultishness that comes in when people attach themselves to a personality rather than principles. And there's a huge difference. Sorry, I'm on a little bit of a rant, but I really feel like this is important, that we maintain our sense of what is right, and that we don't just blindly follow whatever the leader says. In fact, I want to share with you a quote. This is from Jefferson Shoup. He's an author. I would say I'm friends with him, but it's more like I'm well acquainted with him. He says it's a quote from his book. And I cannot remember the name of his book. I actually auditioned to do the audiobook for him, and he was looking for a slightly younger voice. I was like, oh, doggone it. I finally grew up and hit puberty, apparently. Anyway, he posted this on Facebook saying, a reminder for all of us, whichever side of the aisle we're on, to anchor stronger loyalty to principles than to parties and politicians. And this is a conversation between a couple of people here in the book. One of the characters says, if you do this backwards, it's easy to let the man or woman in office define your principles for you, and it's hard to stay consistent. Kendrick slowly paced the front of the room. There's an old tale of a sea captain. His crew wanted a rest from their voyage, so he sailed his ship into the calm waters of a harbor. As the crew readied the anchor, they found a great whale resting directly beneath the ship, so they couldn't drop their anchor. Eventually, they grew tired of waiting for it to leave, so they tied the ropes around the whale instead. Logical, said Jace. The foolish crew drank and sang at the tavern. When they returned out to the pier that evening, the ship was gone. The whale had pulled it far out to sea while the captain slept below deck. Danica nodded, her chin resting on her hand. People change, Kendrick said. They move. Anchor yourself to principles, not to politicians. Otherwise, you'll probably drift without realizing it. Okay, now maybe I'm foolish for thinking that's really profound, but I think that is profound. And I offer that as a caution to, my friends on the right. There are things that Trump has done that I find, really positive and good for him for doing it. On the other hand, there are some things he's doing that I'm just like, oh boy. Someone needs to speak up. And so when those politicians do, or when, a member of the Senate says, hey, I can't go for this, like Senator Rand Paul from Kentucky did, I think it's worth at least hearing it out. But anyway, it sounds like I may be facing a crossroads sometime here in the near future. But I only mentioned this because I wanted to be clear. I see it, and I see the choice that's coming. I would much rather be anchored to principles than to a politician or to a party. By the way, something else that we learned about ourselves with these protests over the weekend, and that is we learned that we are a nation with a powerful government but a weak nation. Jacob Hornberger, this is one of the articles I'm including in today's show notes. He's the president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, one of the most consistent and principled writers, thinkers. He's actually been a candidate for president before, too. Jacob this is a guy whose voice I would recommend to people. I'm not saying you should believe everything he says, but I'm saying you should consider what he has to say because he really is well-grounded in the principles on which the country was founded. He is grounded on sound principles. And one of the things he points out is part of the problem here is that many Americans have been taught to believe that the federal government and the nation are one and the same thing, but they aren't. They are two completely separate and distinct entities. And a good confirmation of this is the phenomenon of the Bill of Rights. Many Americans believe that it gives Americans their rights, but actually, the Bill of Rights protects the nation, that is the American people, from the federal government, which confirms that we're dealing with two separate and distinct entities. He reminds us the Constitution called the federal government into existence. The type of government it established was what we call a limited government republic. It was a very small government whose powers were extremely limited, that is, limited to the few powers enumerated in the Constitution itself. That was how the founding generation wanted it. That's how our American ancestors wanted it. A small, weak federal government, one with very few powers. And he goes into how, they were suspicious of things like a vast, permanent military establishment. That's the last thing that they wanted, because they knew that was what would be used to convert the federal government into a powerful government. They fiercely opposed what they called standing armies. And he walks us through the history of what happened and how that changed, and our transformation into a national security state, which is what created that vast permanent military intelligence establishment with the Pentagon, the CIA, and the NSA. And of course, a new strategy of foreign wars, foreign interventions, foreign coups, state-sponsored assassinations, torture, indefinite detention, and a war on terrorism. And America has become now a land of perpetual war in the quest for perpetual peace. Now, this next part, he says, this is going to hurt some people's feelings, but it needs to be heard. Today's Americans get their sense of toughness vicariously through the use of the vast power of the federal government. So when the federal government threatens or actually uses military force or economic sanctions or embargoes against other nations, that's when you hear Americans step up like they too are being tough. One of their favorite pronouns is we. Well, we showed those Iraqis how tough we were when we attacked, invaded, occupied, and liberated their country. But Jacob Hornberger says what people failed to notice was that in the process of converting the federal government into an all-powerful, omnipotent government with the power to take care of a citizenry and keep the citizenry safe, the result has been to give us a very weak nation. That is, a nation of little serfs who are hopelessly dependent on the federal dole and scared to death of everything, including their own shadows. Imagine the irony. Americans have the most powerful government in history and yet are the most frightened people in the world. And by the way, I think that's a lot of what we saw with these protests over the weekend. Frightened people worried that Elon Musk and Donald Trump are going to stop the gravy train from which they've been feeding. I know, it's the word pathetic comes to mind. This is not to denigrate their fear. Their fear is very real, but they've also been propagandized into believing something that just absolutely does not square with reality. Had a conversation with a loved one, last night, talking about, what's going on here with, I think specifically he had some concerns about health and human services. And I was like, he says, well, the research is going to stop dead. Only other countries will be doing medical research. I don't think that's true at all. There are private foundations. There are private organizations that do immense research. I've worked in the nonprofit side. I know about the foundations that do this kind of stuff. But There's that belief, that stubborn belief. But if the government's not doing it, it's not legit. And I asked the question, well, what if that research becomes politicized, like we saw with Dr. Fauci? Oh, it wouldn't become politicized. There's no way. And I'm like, okay. No point in continuing to argue at that point. If you can't see that it was politicized, it's probably not worth the effort to sit there and argue back and forth, because clearly we're looking at this thing from two very different sides. But that idea that, well, government is what takes care of us, government is what's responsible for making sure that, the research takes place. No. Government may provide funding, but does it not follow? I mean, look, and I'm just talking human nature. I'm not talking political parties. Does it not follow that a person whose funding is dependent on the government is going to make sure that whatever they're reporting is keeping the government happy, or at least those government officials in charge happy enough to keep the money flowing? I could be wrong on this, but to me that seems like a pretty consistent view of human nature. Anyway, I'm going to shift gears here. Another article that I would like to recommend for you, by the way, all of these are available in today's show notes, April 7th, 2025. It's would it surprise you to hear that there was an article out last week about how more single women than ever own homes in America? And whoever shared the article on X posed the question, gee, I wonder what could happen that a woman could become single and a homeowner all at once. Yeah, divorce, and particularly you're seeing feminism, radicalizing women. And this is a great article from Jeff Minnick about how feminism has undermined religion and marriage, but more importantly, how it leads to misery. He starts with a quote from Lucian Conway in an article about why are liberal women so unhappy. And to answer, he starts by reviewing polls revealing the far greater rates of depression and dissatisfaction among liberal women versus their conservative counterparts. You know what's interesting is I had a conversation with a friend of my daughter, and this woman is a bright young woman, well educated, very skilled. She's beautiful. And she cannot find a guy to settle down with. And part of it is she's got a little bit of that, girl boss attitude. But this article from Jeff Minnick really clearly shows that there's been a concerted effort on the part of feminism to drive a wedge between religion and marriage. And essentially what her take is, well, I'm not going to get married because basically if I take on a husband, I'm just taking on another child. I want to have a child someday, but, I don't want to have to raise one, who's already an adult. And I see her point, but at the same time, there's so much unhappiness in that approach. In fact, Jeff Minnick quotes from an article from Joy Pullman, 3 Ways Women Can Make Themselves More Marriageable. Now, that title alone would send a lot of women running for the exits, but worthy as they are, she has 3 pieces of advice here. You ready for this? I'll warn you, they're triggering. Go to church and read the Bible. Resolve past family issues preventing the desire for children. Cultivate feminine habits and traits. I know. It's like walking up to a vampire with a bushel full of garlic. Hi, can I interest you in this? No! Get that out of here. But tucked away in this article is the rock-bottom explanation for why so many liberal women, as well as so many liberal men, are unhappy. She says, well, how people live shapes what they believe. What people believe also shapes how they live. So feminism shapes how we all live now, estranging women from their own biology while also estranging men and women from each other. Jeff says, for half a century, American culture has educated its daughters to become independent, to feel superior to men while striving to become like them, to find work outside the home, to make money, preferably lots of it. Girl power. The future is female. Girls lead. Boys follow. I'm a woman. What's your superpower? These are just some of the bumper sticker slogans that push this lopsided distinction between boys and girls. Now, if you were to reverse that, start saying the future is male, boys lead, girls follow, it might be easier to understand the ugly side of this kind of brainwashing and the damage it's done to boys and to male-female relationships. It's interesting, too. Jeff, in his article, says, look, there's one last irony in the position taken by these women where men were once criticized for upside-down priorities, putting career and advancement ahead of their wives and families. In copycatting them, these liberal women have taken an extra step and eradicated husbands and children altogether. And he says, for at least some of them, this conscious cataclysmic break from tradition will not end well. But I love that he warns, rather than saying, I told you so, he says we might instead feel some sympathy for their unhappiness. After all, they were shaped by their beliefs. Interesting. One last article here, and this is the one we'll wrap it up on. If you want to understand some of the performative leftist outrage that's on display in America, I would recommend talk to someone or listen to someone who once embraced that worldview and then came to her senses. Now, I'm talking about Sasha Stone. If you haven't subscribed to her Substack, it's really worth your time. She wonders whether the Democratic Party is the resistance or simply the drama club. And specifically, she's like, look, you just have to wonder if they were just performing or if they really believe what they're saying. But basically, she's saying the worst thing that ever happened to Democrats is democracy. It must be quite the existential crisis that, after all, the rest of the country rejected the Democrats' opinion of Donald Trump. The guy they said was a rapist, a racist, a fascist, a dictator, a Nazi, a bigot, a transphobe, a misogynist, a Russian asset, a criminal, a felon, a fraudster, a fake, a traitor, an election denier, an insurrectionist, an extremist, a terrorist, a white supremacist, a phony that they impeached twice and indicted 4 times and became the first presidential candidate with a mugshot and to be convicted of a felony, and he still won the popular vote. She says, that's got to really burn. But it isn't the Trump side that's now in a state of perpetual shock because it existed inside a utopian bubble, cutting itself off from the rest of America. It's not the Trump side that cosplayed World War II for so long that it lost touch with reality, either about our world or what actually happened in World War II. It isn't the Trump side that was the empire. She talks about Cory Booker's 20-some-hour filibuster, like he's auditioning to be the charismatic leader the Democrats so desperately need. But the Democrats no longer believe that. They went from don't normalize Trump and his supporters to it's more than justified to demonize, dehumanize, and even terrorize them. These are bad people. They're no longer welcome, not in our culture, restaurants, movie theaters, family gatherings, and most of all, our democracy. And she says their anger stems from their class privilege of having everything they need, yet they can't accept losing something they want. So either the Democrats really are caught up in a mass delusion about who Trump is and why he won, or they're just the drama club. And none of it was even real. Again, you can check out all of these articles and more at thebryanhydeshow.com. You're looking for show notes for April 7th, 2025. Hey, do me a favor while you're on there. Click on my sponsors. If they have something that you could use, maybe do business with them. Let them know that, it was this show that directed you to them.
This is The Bryan Hyde Show.